resourcefulness and bravery of the Palestinians fighting the daily immiseration they have to face by Israeli occupation, there has to be a change in U.S. policy. It seems to me absolutely clear that Israel could not be doing what it's doing now, which is basically to reject and to stand in the way of what is obviously its international obligation, namely to vacate the territories it occupied illegally in 1967, and thereafter to recognize the sovereign existence of a Palestinian people in its own state. That Israel cannot continue to refuse to do that were it not for the unconditional support of the United States. That is to say, I'll give you a perfect example. The roadmap, which is a plan to bring peace between Palestinians and Israelis, a plan written by the so-called Quartet, the Soviet Union, Russia, the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union, has been accepted outright by the Palestinians. The Israelis have not accepted it. And Sharon has said that he will not accept it until he comes to Washington in June and to speak to George Bush about his, I don't know, I've heard 15 objections, I've heard 100 objections he has to it. But the intransigence of Sharon and his people would not be possible were it not for the support of Washington. And Washington would not be possible were it not for the fact that it takes for granted the quiescence, the somnolence, the passive acceptance of most Americans in just accepting this as a matter of fact. The fact is that the United States supplies Israel with $5 billion a year.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I want to talk about the recent clashes between Israel and West Bank violence that we're seeing, clashes that have spiraled out of control, in which there was a recent shooting. A Palestinian gunman had killed 7 people, wounded 3 in a synagogue on the outskirts of Jerusalem just last Friday, which basically precipitated an attack that heightened, fears of a continuous bloodshed that has already had much bloodshed in the last 40 years. According to Reuters, in which I'm going to share the screen with you here, police said the gunman arrived around 8:15 p.m., opened fire, hitting a number of people before he was killed by police. And of course, TV footage showed several victims lying in the road outside the synagogue being tended to by emergency workers. It also goes on to say that the attack, which police described as a terrorist incident, which it is, underlined fears of an escalation in violence after months of clashes in the West Bank, culminating in a raid in Jenin on Thursday that killed at least 9 Palestinians. And what I want to do in this video is basically give you a rundown about a very brief history about the clashes between what's been happening in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and of course the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, led by the Zionist governments under Ariel Sharon, and of course now with his 3rd tenure as Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And so, like I say, with just about most of my videos, you'll know it's coming from a very unbiased point of view, and I don't vote and I don't adhere to any human ideology. So I'm going to be very frank, and whatever I use as information, of course, will be in the description. For a little bit about the background of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, for those who don't know, it is actually one of the world's most enduring conflicts that has lasted the last almost now 100 years. And so what I'll read is just a little brief history behind it. The Israeli-Palestine conflict, which has been made into a large conglomeration involving indirectly and directly the United States, public declarations of claims to a Jewish homeland in Palestine, including the First Zionist Congress of 1897 and later the Balfour Declaration of 1917, created early tensions in the region. Following World War I, the mandate of Palestine included a binding obligation for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Immediately thereafter, tensions grew into an open sectarian conflict between the Arab and the Jew. In 1947, the United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine, which was never implemented, provoked the 1947-1949 Palestine War. The current Israeli-Palestine status quo began following the Israeli military occupation of the Palestinian territories in the 1967 Six-Day War. Since then, progress has been made towards a two-state solution with the Oslo Accords 1993-1995 under President Clinton. Final status issues included the status of Jerusalem, Israeli settlements, borders, security, even water rights, and the Palestinian freedom of movement and the right of return. What has precipitated from all this is a volley of violence and conflict in the region, which is rich in sites of historic, cultural, and even religious value worldwide. It has been the subject of numerous international conferences dealing with historic rights, starting with Amnesty International, the U.S. Supreme Court, the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court of South Africa, which led to the Goldstone Report, and of course, the World Health Organization and human rights organizations around the world. There's been a lot of opinions and views, but nothing has come from it. The two parties that have engaged in direct negotiations have been the Israeli government and the Palestine Liberation Organization, otherwise known as the PLO, in which official negotiations have been mediated by a quartet on the Middle East, which is basically a foursome of nations, international supportive entities involving mandating the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, as well as the United Nations, United States, Russia, and the European Union. And the Arab League, which proposed an alternative peace plan, is another important factor to talk about. Egypt, a founding member of the Arab League, has historically been a key participant in the Arab-Israeli conflict and related negotiations, more so than the Egypt-Israeli peace treaty. The conflicts that have arisen from this have been brutal and entirely one-sided. In the description box below, I will lead you to a document from Illinois Wesleyan University, written by Lorena S. Neal, The Roots of the Palestine-Israeli Conflict between 1882 to 1914, which leads us to the current predisposition currently happening in the disputed territories, the occupied territories, and the Israeli government, as well as the Israeli people who are caught in between all this. And then in 2021, Amnesty International wrote a report called Israel and the Occupied Palestinian Territories, in which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who lost parliamentary elections on March 23rd after 12 years in office because it was marred by corruption, in which a new coalition government was approved by June 13th, bringing power to Jewish supremacist, centrist, and left-wing parties in alliance with an Islamist party. And what happened between May 10th and May 21st was that there was armed conflict between the Israel and Palestinian armed groups in the Gaza Strip. It was the fifth Israel-Gaza conflict in the last 15 years. And in Israeli towns where both Jewish and Palestinian citizens live, there was inter-ethnic violence, which led to killings, clashes, damage to property. The murder rate involving Palestinian citizens of Israel were proportionally 25 times higher than cases involving Jewish citizens of Israel, who constitute about 80% of the population. And according to the non-governmental organization Amman, criminals killed 110 Palestinian citizens of Israel in 2021, which was the highest number in decades. I'll link you the Amnesty report in the description. Now, in the last 12 months, you've had a number of airstrikes and militants firing into Israel in 2022. One of the longest clashes on record was from August 5th to August 7th, in which the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, conducted approximately 147 airstrikes in Gaza, in which the Palestinian militants fired approximately 1,100 rockets towards Israel. This information is coming from the Bloomberg Report, August 7, 2022. The operation was ordered by the Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, and Defense Minister Benny Gantz, and this was done without cabinet discussion or approval. This was followed by a raid in Jenin, which is basically a Palestinian city in northern West Bank, in which Israeli forces arrested Bassam al-Assadi, who is a leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a Palestinian Islamist paramilitary force which began in 1981. On August 6th, Israel arrested 20 people in the West Bank, in which 19 were members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The initial attack included the infamous murder of Taysir al-Jabari, who was a military leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And on the second day, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander of the southeastern area of the Strip, Khalid Mansout, was targeted and killed. This caused a declaration of war between the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Israel. And who gets caught in the middle? Palestinian citizens, in which most of the deaths came from. Never comes from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It never comes from the IDF. Clashes resulted in the death of 50 Palestinians, 17 in which were children. A number of articles were written on the subject. UN News on August 8th, 2022. Al Jazeera, September 9th, 2022. And of course, the IDF stated that over a dozen of these deaths, including 12 of the children, were caused by failed Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket launches. This was disputed by the father of one of the victims, reported by Al Jazeera on August 10th, while other Gaza residents and journalists state that they saw the firing coming from the Israeli side. Of course, there's an independent inquiry, and on August 13th, Haaretz, which is a liberal publication, reported that misfires from the Palestinians killed 14 civilians, including 7 children, and that 20% of the rockets fell short into Gaza, while Gaza military, led by the IDF, killed a disproportionate number of the children itself. Richard Goldstone, who's a South African former judge, I'm going to be talking about in just a minute, wrote an infamous report called the Goldstone Report in 2011, in which I will read you from the report, and we'll read along together. Richard Goldstone is a South African a South African former judge, and after working for 17 years as a commercial lawyer, was appointed by the South African government to serve on the Transvaal Supreme Court from 1980 to 1989, and the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court of South Africa from 1990 to 1994. He is considered to be one of several liberal judges who issued key rulings that undermine apartheid from within the system by tempering the worst effects of the country's racial laws. Among other important rulings, Goldstone made the Group Areas Act, under which non-whites were banned from living in whites-only areas, virtually unworkable by restricting evictions. His work investigating violence led directly to being nominated to serve as the first chief prosecutor of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. He also reported on the human rights crimes that were happening during the Gaza war. And in 2009, Goldstone led a fact-finding mission created by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate international human rights and humanitarian law violations related to the Gaza war. The mission concluded that Israel and Hamas had both potentially committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, findings which sparked outrage in Israel and the initiation of a personal campaign against Goldstone. In fact, in 2009, Richard Goldstone went to appear on Al Jazeera to talk about those defamations brought on by the Israeli government.
Richard Goldstone, welcome to Talk to Al Jazeera. President Shimon Peres is the latest to talk about the Goldstone Report. He said, quote, "It's outrageous that a respected institution like the United Nations provides a platform to spread lies and stories about Israel." Very much the sort of message we've had from Israel about your report. What's your response?
Well, you know, I think people generally don't like to be accused of criminal activity, and so it didn't surprise me that there was criticism, even strong criticism, and it has come from both sides. But I do regret the extremes to which some of the criticism has gone, and the fact that it's been so personalised.
Yeah, that is interesting. It has been very personalised, and actually just in the last few days we've had sort of bastions of the liberal intelligentsia now weighing in. Harold Evans, the newspaper editor and the person who set up Human Rights Watch, you know, and they're calling it half-baked. They're being rather patronising to you. They say you've been duped by war criminals and so on. What do you feel when you hear all this stuff? Well,
obviously it saddens me that one of the founders of Human Rights Watch has adopted an attitude that a human rights organisation should only investigate closed societies and not violations of human rights or humanitarian law committed by democracies. I mean, that's not what I think people in the human rights movement understand.
But would you accept that Israel is having a disproportionate amount of attention being put on it, though?
Well, I suppose you know that's I suppose a sign of success. It wasn't the report certainly hasn't been ignored, and as I say, I suppose that's something that I think when one takes a step back, and I think with the passage of time, I hope it will be seen to be having served some useful purpose.
But amongst the other personal accusations are that you're doing this out of personal ambition, that you may one day want to be UN Secretary General. It was one thing I read, and that's why you want to get your name back in the limelight and so on.
Right. Well,
what do you say to
that's a ridiculous allegation. That really came out of a joke that appeared in the Guardian in London by a journalist who put it as a joke. And in fact, I remember calling him back and leaving, and he wasn't there. I left a message to say that Richard called. But it was really at the level of a joke, and it's now been elevated to something that came out of the Johannesburg barn. But that's a sort of personal attack that hasn't. This is not a first time for me. I had it in South Africa. Investigated violence there.
And they say that you didn't actually investigate crimes by the ANC, just by the apartheid.
No,
regime.
both. On both. We looked at violence on all sides. And I was attacked vehemently by government supporters and by ANC supporters.
But I mean, again, another tag being used is, and this was by Harold Evans in the London Guardian or the Manchester Guardian, saying that the report itself is half-baked. And I suppose, I mean, it's a 600-page report, and if anything, actually, I would suggest it was rather distressingly annotated and backed up. Do you ever get the impression that no one's actually, or many of these detractors have actually read this report?
I've no doubt. Many of the critics, I would say the overwhelming majority of the critics, haven't read the report. And you know, what proves that, I think, is the level of criticism doesn't go to the substance of the report. There still haven't been responses to the really serious allegations that are made.
And it's interesting because, I mean, you do deal with many of the defences put up by spokespeople for the Israeli government, such as, look, we were under constant attack, we have a right to self-defense, Hamas used human shields, and so on. But you do deal with each one of these arguments in the report and acknowledge them and give arguments against them. But I've heard them from Israeli spokespeople being used again there. It's very strange, actually. I mean, can we put most of those arguments to rest now, though? And ultimately, this idea that the IDF uses the utmost care in its military operations. Doesn't your report finally put that idea to rest?
Well, I would have hoped so, and this is why it's really crying out for a proper investigation. I mean, ours was a fact-finding mission. It wasn't a criminal investigation. We didn't look into the criminal liability of a single person. That needs to be done on both sides.
But I mean, next time though, an Israeli spokesperson says, we were under attack, no country can stand this, we have a right to self-defense. What would the response be based on the findings of your report?
Well, we didn't look at that, at the justification for the military operations at all. We took them as a given. What we looked at wasn't what's known in technically as jus ad bellum, the right to use force. We looked at jus in bellum, the way force was actually used. So we didn't question.
But are they not connected? That seems to be the Israeli argument.
Absolutely not. The international humanitarian law deals with the way wars are fought, not whether they're just wars or unjust wars or legal wars or illegal wars. So we didn't question Israel's right of self-defense.
So where does that leave the Obama administration's response?
Well, you know, it seems to be still developing. It's been ambivalent, I think. The Obama administration joined our recommendation calling for full good faith investigations both in Israel and in Gaza, but said that the report was flawed. But I've yet to hear from the Obama administration what the flaws in the report that they've identified are. I mean, I'd be happy to respond to them if and when I know what they are.
I mean, on the morning that the report was released, the White House spokesman said they had concerns, but then admitted that he hadn't read the report.
Right.
Doesn't that concern you about this administration?
Well, it concerns me about generally about criticisms that have come, as you correctly suggest, from people who appear not to have read the report.
But when the Nobel Commission awards Barack Obama the Nobel Peace Prize, for re-engaging with the international community and for a new way of doing business, or a reversion to a way of doing business, wasn't this one of the first tests?
Well, I think, you know, I interpreted that as being a sort of acclamation of a change from the Bush administration.
But no, I mean, the Commission, the Nobel Commission said that he was re-engaging with international bodies. I mean, if the UN Human Rights Council, and actually the US getting its seat back on the UN Human Rights Council has been seen as a sign that things have changed.
Have moved. Well, they have changed. I think that's unquestionably so.
But they've dismissed your report without reading it.
Well, I don't think they dismissed it. I think, as I say, they joined it to a certain extent and said there were some flaws which, as I've said, haven't been identified. But I don't think it's been dismissed.
But you're not concerned at all, then? That,
well, of course I'm concerned, and I'd like to engage with the Obama administration, and so at least informally. I mean, my official job's over. The mission's completed its work, but I would like to know what the...
Has there been any interest there in getting more information from you or any of the members of your of the mission to get more information as to how...
Not on any official basis.
I interviewed the Israeli ambassador to the US, And I asked him, was there any pressure at all to set up an independent inquiry and follow the recommendations of Goldstone? And he actually sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, none at all, absolutely none. I mean, what's your reaction to that?
I think that's changed to an extent. I read in this morning's news that the Israeli cabinet is split down the middle.
Right, Dan Meridor now suggesting that there should be. So but if the US ambassador said to me, absolutely no pressure whatsoever, so it doesn't even come up. I mean, is that not?
Well, that disappoints me, because I think the report, but also it's not only the report. There have been many requests from Israeli and Palestinian organizations, human rights organizations, for months, calling for open investigations into the.
But given the gravity of what you found in this report, though, I mean, can one just take the sort of well, you know, it's bad, but we'll give the Obama administration the benefit of the doubt. The report has found the systematic destruction of the civilian infrastructure, the systematic humiliation of the civilian population. The strategy was to transgress international humanitarian law. Doesn't that require immediate action?
Well, I would have thought so, but it's disappointing that it's that it's being put off. And
oh, Judge Goldstone, we're going to take a break, but we'll come back and look at some of the details inside the report in a few moments. We'll be right back.
So what did the report find? That more than 1,400 Gazans and 13 Israelis were killed in the Gaza war from December 27, 2008 to January 18, 2009. The report itself published its 574-page findings on September of 2009. And the report called for both parties, both Hamas and Israel, to investigate their own actions and accuse both of deliberately targeting civilians. So what do you think happened to Richard Goldstone? Well, he was vilified by pro-Israel groups as a self-hating Jew. Sounds familiar? It's exactly what they did with Norman Finkelstein. And his report was likened to a blood libel, a false charge against Jews with roots in medieval anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, the report galvanized Israel to start investigations into the charges that were made against the military operations, which, by the way, are still ongoing today. And Goldstone immediately was boycotted by Jewish communities around the world, and he wasn't even allowed to attend his bar mitzvah of his grandson in South Africa. And the report appeared to have been shelved, of course, by Benjamin Netanyahu, until Goldstone published an article forced upon him in the Washington Post on April 1st, in which he questioned his own findings of the mission he headed. Quote, "If I had known then what I know now, the Goldstone report would have been very different document," end quote. But as you can see, even with the latest findings in the Goldstone report of war crimes, even with a hereditary Jew like Goldstone is, he will be vilified and decreed as a traitor to his own country. What does that say about a government that will actually lambaste, vilify, and try to destroy the livelihood of a liberal judge in South Africa with ties to Israel? Well, that didn't stop from the international community to report on war crimes.
In Gaza last summer, more than 2,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians, were killed. Over 11,000 were injured, and entire neighborhoods virtually wiped off the map. For months, disturbing questions have been raised about what really happened when Israel launched its attack, in response, it says, to Hamas rocket fire. Now, an unprecedented report has laid bare shocking allegations about the indiscriminate use of force, allegations leveled by the very soldiers who were right there on the front lines.
ושם זה כמו המערב הפרוע, וזה גם היה כאילו באישור מהקודקודים, מהמפקדים. הרגשתי שמשהו מוסרי נרקב בצבא הזה, אם האישור הוא ככה, כי זה הדגל שלנו, שאנחנו לא הורגים כל דבר. ושם באים אליי באופן ישיר, אומרים לי, כל מה שנמצא לידך צריך למות. ואני גם השתתפתי בזה, אני גם עשיתי את זה, ואני כאילו מתחרט על זה. אני הרגתי אנשים שמן הסתם רובם לא עשו לי כלום.
Israel claims it always sought to avoid civilian casualties, including by issuing warnings to clear areas. But many of the soldiers say this provided a pretext to indiscriminately open fire on those left behind, even when the targets might be innocent civilians.
כל בן אדם שאתם רואים הוא לא אמור להיות שם, כי צה"ל הוריד חוזים לאוכלוסייה להתפנות מהאזור. ואם הוא לא אמור להיות שם, אז אוטומטית הוא לא חף מפשע, ואנחנו רשים באש.
One soldier said his instructions were clear. Any person you run into that you see with your eyes, shoot to kill. Another said the assumption was the moment we went in, anyone who dared poke his head out was a terrorist. This tallies with Channel 4 News' own investigation into the killing of Salam Shamali, who was shot after getting too close to Israeli soldiers.
Well, if you send soldiers with rules of engagement that anyone in the area, in the zone where you enter, is a legitimate target and he doesn't have to pose a threat to you, the fact that he's there is the threat, you cannot say you've done everything to avoid civilian casualties. It's just a lie.
This report raises some important issues, but there is some additional information to keep in mind. The claims are unbased, unsubstantiated, and unnamed. In order to make a substantial inquiry, we need to fill in the gaps.
The IDF says it's conducting its own investigations to fill in those gaps. But as anger over the devastation in Gaza lingers on, the scale and scope of these shocking new details are already intensifying demands for a major international war crime.
Groups like Breaking the Silence, which you just saw in the past video, which make up of former Israeli IDF soldiers, starting from the onset of the Second Intifada, speak out against the crimes afforded on the Palestinians in Gaza Strip. But that didn't stop other human rights organizations like the UN Human Rights Council, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and have accused the Israeli government of violating international law in regards to collective punishment, targeting civilians, proportionality, and prohibiting access to medical assistance, and using civilians as human shields. In fact, Richard Falk, who is the part of the United Nations Special Rapporteur to the human rights in occupied territories, said that such actions are in violation of international humanitarian law governing the obligations of an occupying force and the laws of war. In fact, Israel is not part of the Rome Statutes, as well as the United States. It's no wonder why both countries get away with so much human rights and war crimes abuses. Now, the Israeli government has responded to all these accusations by stating that the use of force in the Gaza Strip are in self-defense. Just today, Nikki Haley actually reported on Twitter that Israel has a right to self-defense. This is almost like a robotic mantra that I've been seeing over the past 20 years on viral media. Israel has a right to defend itself. It's almost very robotic and sheepish, almost as it's brainwashing. But you'll notice that in the United States itself, that a large proportion of Zionists themselves are Christian evangelicals. However, this doesn't pertain to how Israel influences our government from both the Republic establishment as well as the Democratic establishment. In fact, one of the largest foreign agencies in the world that is quite influential in lobbying our politics is the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, also known as AIPAC. Reports by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights ordered a series of periodic reports aimed to assess the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. And the first of the reports came after the Goldstone Report in 2011. This one was presented to the Council in September of 2009, in which the report compiled by the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Navi Pillay, alleged that the Israeli IDF breached numerous laws of armed conflict by attacking indiscriminately, I might add, civilians in at least several incidents, by targeting civilians and protecting facilities, and by damaging large number of buildings, and also by failing to provide unquestionably effective warnings to civilians as they shot rocket launchers and missiles from planes into the occupied territories. The Human Rights Council would later write that, as well as many other non-governmental organizations agreed, notable figures such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have accused Israel of imposing collective punishment on the population of the Gaza Strip by the blockade, invasion, and bombardment of Gaza. Michael Krauss is the professor of law at George Mason University, and Abraham Bell, the director of the International Law Forum at the Jerusalem Center Public Affairs, argued that the bar on collective punishment forbids the imposition of criminal or military penalties, which included imprisonment or death, on some people for crimes committed by other individuals, leading to the conclusion that none of Israel's actions involved the imposition of criminal-type penalties. So what do we do here in the United States? Do we continue to speak out against war crimes, or do we stay silent? In order for this to stop, we need more good people to speak out on it. And we do have a lot of groups speaking out against the crimes afforded to the Palestinians. And what do the Palestinians have to do to stop the violence? Do they have to give up more land, less water, less resources, eliminate the only defense that they have, which are from these ghoulish Islamic organizations like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad? For the Palestinians don't have a standing military. And even then, those two groups could be easily destroyed by Israel not acquiescing to the Gulf, or by just going in and destroying the entire hierarchy. They'd rather let these organizations exist, because without them, Israel can't blame everybody for being a part of Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Then what are they to do without an entity that is very reactionary? They can always blame the Palestinians for allowing these groups to exist. But unfortunately for the Palestinians, they don't have a standing military like Israel does. The United States itself has been nothing but a prostitute for the country itself. That's a very harsh term, but obviously it is to any thinking person. And so, until we can get enough people to acquiesce to the pleas of the Palestinian people, and also to the complete silence of the Arab community who have been bought out by the Israeli lobbies, countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and to the countries that offer aid to Israel, like Syria, Iran, Lebanon. Well, those are the countries we are at war with. The countries that we should be destabilizing are the Gulf countries that gave us this Wahhabi ideology and who participate in the silence of the Palestinian cries for the end to the occupation by the Israeli military. And not only are the Palestinian people victims, but so are the Israelis, who are trying to speak out against this brutal regime headed under these very fanatic leftists and, of course, the hard right Zionist politics that predominate the country today. The United States has to do more, and it has to come from the people. Our government is sold and bought out. They will acquiesce. They will not alleviate the pressures of the Israeli government, which are afforded to and victimizing the Palestinians. We have to put pressure on the government itself. For if we do not, these crimes will continue to present day, and in the future, we'll have a bloody sunrise.